And welcome to tonight's edition of the Sunday Night Sitdown. Tonight is a special live edition where we're going to sit down with a local lawmaker and talk about a variety of issues, including environmental justice, and the integrity of elections, as well as other local issues, as well as get to know a little bit better one of the new up-and-coming political rising stars in Western Pennsylvania. And that is our guest tonight, State Representative Jessica Benham. We're really excited to have her on. We're going to have a really, great conversation about the work that she's doing, as a new lawmaker in her first term, representing, parts of the city of Pittsburgh, as well as some northern communities north of the city of Pittsburgh. And, we're just really excited to have this discussion on the second Sunday night sit down. And for those who were not able to join us last week, we had State Representative Malcolm Kenyatta, who just recently announced his candidacy for the United States Senate. So every Sunday night at 7 p.m., we're going to sit down with a local, statewide, regional lawmaker, elected official, policymaker, and have a deeper conversation than we may have on our Monday night Power Hour show. So I'm excited to have my team here as usual, Ryan White and Miracle Jones here as well. Welcome. And before we bring on our esteemed guests, is there anything out there, quick takes that you want to discuss that are that are on your mind right now?
Yes, and we do want to. We know right now in Pittsburgh there is the vigil going on downtown, the Stop Asian Hate vigil, and our hearts and our thoughts and prayers are with the families of the victims. Some of us are not in the city of Pittsburgh right now, so we are not there. There are other people from the greater One Hood team who are there, so we do want to start to give our hearts, thoughts, and prayers to the survivors, their families, and also just call on people to reject hate, reject bigotry, reject bias, and to actively work to make this community, our city, and our nation one that's inclusive, one that supports like equity and diversity and inclusion and policies and action, because that's how we all are safe.
Absolutely. Ryan?
Yeah, I just wanted to first of all echo Miracle's entire message, related to the tragedies in Georgia last week, and the importance of that vigil and all the other events going on right now, to express solidarity with the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, and to stand up against these hate crimes and that Asian hate in general, and just show solidarity and support however we can. Even if it's just showing up for vigils and things like that. And then a couple other important things I wanted to mention. First of all, we have the new rental relief assistance program in Allegheny County that I believe started last week. And so I just wanted to, make sure we spotlight that for a moment, let folks know that it's now open to apply to, and that it's something you need to apply to in order to get assistance.
Absolutely, yeah, and I just want to echo the sentiments already shared, about this moment that we're having as a nation, and I think if there's anything positive that can come from it, is potentially this conversation that's long overdue, about bigotry toward, our Asian American brothers and sisters, from the Exclusion Acts, and from, various racist policies, dating back 150 to 200 years, and the erasure of, Asian Americans from so much of the American history of the West. So hopefully, this moment, while so tragic, can, allow us to be honest about our history and to lift up those stories that have been, buried so deep, in books and libraries, down aisles that nobody walks. If we can, find something positive for that, hopefully that's, one of the things about this long overdue, honest conversation about the history of this country.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have these conversations, because we have a lot of first in Pittsburgh. We have, last week when we talked with Representative Malcolm Kenyatta, he was the first openly queer Black man to run for a Senate seat still in 2021. We are breaking boundaries. Even our next guest broke boundaries as well with her historic run. And so with that, we want to welcome Representative Jessica, who gave us permission to call her Jess, to the platform to talk about her historic run and some of the things that she's interested in doing in the next couple of years. So welcome, Jess. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you all doing?
Doing fantastic. Well, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with the first question before we get into the policy and what you're working on right now. Can you kind of just walk us through your journey, to Harrisburg? How did this all come about, and then we'll talk a little bit about why you being a state representative is so historic in so many different ways. But before we get into that, let's just get into the backstory of how did this historic journey begin.
Yeah, I never thought that I would run for office. I always thought that my work would be as an activist and an advocate. I think it's hard to see yourself in a elected position if you don't see other people who are like you as role models. And so as someone who is bisexual and queer, as someone who is autistic, I really didn't see a ton of role models, even nationally, of folks who had run for office and successfully been given the honor to represent their communities. And so it just wasn't something that I thought was going to be in my life. And then I began to step up in my community in other leadership roles, whether that was helping with water management projects in our local park or organizing around the issue of gun violence that we were facing in my local community. And folks began to ask me to step up and run. And honestly, the first person who asked me, I laughed because I thought they were joking. I was like, yeah, the queer autistic girl should definitely run for office in South Pittsburgh. That's a good one. That's really funny. But it turned out that they were serious. And, as a pastor's daughter, my dad always talked about feeling this call to the ministry. And I began to feel this call to serve my community in this way. And maybe that's just being a pastor's kid. I don't know. But more and more folks asked me to step up and run. And I'll be honest, it's really uncomfortable. I'm a working class kid who grew up poor, and I don't feel like the halls of power were built for people like me. But in the same way, they were not built for so many people in my community that I now have the honor of representing. And I'm reminded in just millions of tiny little ways that this is not a space that should ever be comfortable for anyone. I mean, I'm sitting in this chair right now, right, which is like fancy office chair, and no matter how, it's as low as it goes, and my feet are still 3 inches off the floor. And that is just one of those tiny little ways where I'm reminded that this is a space that wasn't built for women. It wasn't built for short people. It was not built for people like me. And so when I come into this space in Harrisburg, I always say I come, 60,000 people strong, because it is the voices of my community and, frankly, the voices of unheard people throughout the Commonwealth that I try to bring with me into the halls of Harrisburg. And someday when we can physically be here again, with when COVID is, fingers crossed, in our past, it will be wonderful to bring in more folks physically to Harrisburg to kind of reclaim this space. And I know other state reps and senators have been trying to do that work as well.
Thank you. And for those who are just joining us, this is the Sunday Night Sit-Down with One Hood Power, and we are here with Jessica Benham, State Representative. Miracle, next question.
Yes, so you were talking a lot about, being one of the first queer autistic candidates for South Pittsburgh. There's been a lot of conversation about how authentic and personal candidates need to be, the motivations. But for you, from the very beginning, since you launched, you were very clear about who you were and why that you were running. And so what was that decision like? Because a lot of times people are still very fearful of being so open politically with things that are so personal to them.
I was muted. Sorry about that. It was never really an option for me to hide who I was. It's never been how I've lived my life. Though I will say, having grown up in a deeply religious family, I was closeted for my entire youth. It really wasn't until I came to college that I felt comfortable enough to be open about who I was. And I kind of swore to myself at that point that I would never hide that again. And so for me, running as an out queer woman, being open about being autistic, that was part of just who I was as a person. And I think you're exactly right. We need more people who are authentic and transparent and real. I think sometimes folks forget that elected officials are human. And I try to show that humanity all the time, because I'm just a person like everyone else, which I think is part of why that title is a little bit uncomfortable for me, because it just still doesn't feel like it fits, if that makes any sense at all. But I think at the end of the day, being open about who I am has allowed me to already influence conversations about what kinds of policies we should be proposing. It's allowed me to come into a space and say, you don't get to say that you have talked to the autistic community about this bill just because you've talked to me. Because as a white autistic person, there is no way that I am reflective of the vast diversity that exists in the autistic community. And so to have that opportunity to not only be in that space and advocate for the needs of people like me, but to say, hey, this conversation is not enough. I'm turning around, looking behind me and saying, who else needs to be here? I think that has been honestly one of the best parts of this, because I get to say that, my journey has been difficult, but the journey of the person and the people who come after me will be easier. Hopefully, it's not easy. I do get threats, and that's scary. But I also think about the fact that, when I walk down the street every day, I can be a bit invisible. My queerness is not always read immediately. And so I don't necessarily feel, and I feel the fear of being a woman, walking down the street every day, but I don't necessarily feel that same fear that, for example, our Asian community members are really intensely feeling right now. And so even in the midst of all this difficulty, I still try to recognize that fear is not the same fear, and certainly not as intense of a fear as other members of our community face every single day. And I think that also is part of what drives me forward.
Absolutely. Next question from Ryan.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for just talking about your own experiences, and really highlighting that importance of, inclusivity and representation in politics and in general. And along those same lines, I wanted to give you the opportunity to talk about some legislation that you've proposed with Representative Dan Miller, and your efforts through this legislation to create a new department of accessibility and inclusion in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, so I'm incredibly excited about this piece of legislation because it's an opportunity for us to have a voice for disabled people at the level of the cabinet and the governor's office, which I think is something that is just critically important. To have someone whose entire focus is justice for disabled people, who has the ear of the governor, I mean, that it's something we don't have right now and that we desperately need. But the bill does other things as well. It requires the creation of a state plan for disability, which means we have to collect data and we have to plan for the future, a future where disabled people can thrive here. And then it also brings together the vast majority of services, state services that disabled people are consumers of under one roof, which I think is really helpful. It's meant to be kind of a one-stop shop. So rather than having to go around to all of these different departments to get your needs met, you can get them in one spot. And there are a couple exceptions to that. Drug and alcohol programs remain in kind of their own sphere. Mental health, because most of it is just so tightly tied with billing, still stays in the Department of Health. But for the most part, I mean, Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, anything Office of Developmental Programs, all that stuff comes under one roof, which I think is going to make our service provision as a state more accessible and more effective, as well as more efficient. And all of that to me is really important because, we know that so many groups, right, are underrepresented in Harrisburg and in our nation's capital. And I think each step that we take toward resolving that for any group is very important. So I'm super pumped about that bill. And if folks are watching, please encourage your state representative to sign on to that bill as a co-sponsor.
And now, how has support been up to this point? What has the reaction been from your colleagues?
Generally good. I think a lot of folks, when I explain or when Representative Miller explains what this bill does and why it's important, people are really enthusiastic about getting involved. I think one of the things that my presence here in the Capitol has really indicated to folks is that they don't spend enough time thinking about disability, and they don't think about the fact that all policy is disability policy. And I come into this space and I see disability so intimately intertwined with so many other issues. When I think about environmental racism, for example, I see that as an issue of disability justice as well, because when we concentrate pollution in Black and brown communities and in poor communities, we are literally disabling people, entire generations, and that's a disability justice issue. So I try to help folks understand all of those ways in which our liberation is bound up together, and I'm just so excited about the opportunity to do that. And I think that this bill, as it's a first step. It doesn't get us anywhere close to justice, but I do think it makes a difference, and folks do seem to be excited about it.
Going to go to Miracle for the next question.
Yes, and again, thank you so much for expounding on the things that your bill does, because I know even we're talking about COVID-19 still being here, but that has created a new sector of people who are now engaging with being disabled, some for the first times in their life. And so I was wondering, what are these conversations like? Because a lot of times people have almost a stereotypical view of what a disability is, and they think that the ADA kind of make sure that everyone who is disabled has, these accommodations, and that's not the case. So what are these, some of the conversations that you're having, and what are some key takeaways that you want? And again, you're not speaking for the whole disabled community, but what are some takeaways that you want people to understand why this bill is so important and the work that you're doing is so important?
Yeah, I have heard some of my colleagues dismiss the deaths of people like me as though they're unimportant, just because we've got pre-existing conditions. And that is so beyond unacceptable, to dismiss the death of anyone simply because of something far beyond their control, when they have, that a life that was lost, that could have been lived, family, friends, a whole community. And, one of the things we've been talking about in conversations with other disabled people is how we're losing yet another generation of elders. And there's so much history that we lose when that happens. And certainly as a queer person who, with our community lost a whole generation of elders too, it is, you can tell I'm emotional about it. It's really hard. And so to be in this space where some people don't think that I'm fully human or fully worthy of rights is hard. But I do it because it matters, and I do it because it's important for my community. And I think that this bill goes a long way to demonstrating that the rights of disabled people are important. As you pointed out, people do think that the ADA is, it's like, oh, just go to the ADA office and they'll take care of you. And that's just not how it works. The ADA was a compromise bill, and it's only enforceable through lawsuit. And so, there are many pieces of legislation that do grant a sort of patchwork of protections for disabled people, but none of them go far enough. And certainly on the federal level, the Disability Integration Act, I think, is a great example of a lot of the steps that we need to take nationally to ensure that folks with disabilities are not just included in society, but are able to thrive in our world. And you're right. Because of COVID, and I think particularly about what people are calling COVID-19 long haulers, we have more and more folks who have become disabled. And when we think about, again, which communities were more likely to be exposed to COVID-19, we can see the ways in which disability and race and class are all intertwined, right? Because we're talking about essential workers, we're talking about folks who are more likely to be Black and brown. I mean, we can go through the list, right? We know who's more likely to get COVID, to not get the treatment that they needed to fully recover from it, or just because of, I don't know, their exposure to air pollution happen to have a worse case of it. And that's just, again, another example of the ways in which all of these things are tied up together. And we can't just think about disability in a silo, which right now I would say is where a lot of my colleagues are at. They certainly care about making sure that folks with disabilities can live a good life, but they're not necessarily thinking about the ways in which disability is so connected to everything else.
Right. And again, for those who are just joining us, this is the Sunday Night Sit-Down with One Hood Power. And we are here with State Representative Jessica Benham, and we're going to go to Ron White for the next question.
Yeah, thanks, Kahari. And so, continuing on with what you're talking about how all of these things intersect and intertwine, and the way that COVID has disparately impacted a lot of these groups. I've seen you speak before about how COVID-19 and all of the byproducts of the pandemic have really disproportionately impacted the community of folks with disabilities. And so just to give you an opportunity to speak about, some of the resources or policy changes, or maybe just, changes in people's general perception or approach to this issue that are most important in centering that fact and correcting that issue of disparate impact.
Yeah, I think I'll talk about vaccines because I think that's something that we haven't really talked about yet. But one of the things that happened with the vaccination process is that people with disabilities who are more likely to get COVID, especially those who are living in congregate care, were not given prioritization in the governor's vaccination plan. And that's a problem because of course we want to prioritize our older adults, our elders, those who are 65 plus, but to exclude an entire population, many of whom live in long-term care and congregate care, was a problem. And thankfully, the governor did issue guidance and correct some of that. But we're still seeing that people with, for example, intellectual and developmental disabilities are generally not eligible to get the vaccine, even if they happen to live in a group home or if they have staff coming in and out of the home to take care of them, which I think was something that yet again was not really talked about. The focus was on people living in congregate care, which as it should be, but to ignore folks who often have, maybe 5 or 6 staff members, coming in and out of the house every day, potentially bringing COVID with them, I think was a problem. And so I think that's one of those things that having somebody at the cabinet level who's really talking about disability could help correct. We could say, we need to make sure that we are prioritizing all of these groups, and we can figure out some prioritization within that, but we need to be clear about our motivation and about centering the folks who are at greatest risk when it comes to COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I did want to, just jump back a little bit, to your experience, deciding, to jump into office, without, rehashing, the entire election, not only obviously were you, breaking so many barriers, and shattering, glass ceilings all over the place, throughout your campaign, but, you did take on, a very, established, political family. It wasn't like you just took on, your everyday neighborhood state representative. You took on, the brother of the former mayor, someone who, had been, involved in politics for 3 generations, a family, so again, without.
Wrong candidate though. That was Emily Kincaid who did that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's all good. We are easily confused because, she took on Ravenstall and I challenged Reed Shaw. And so it just, it's very easy to confuse.
No, I apologize for the miscue. Now, thank you for that. But then again, it's the same, kind of thing. We look at, someone like Harry Reiss, someone, is a institution, not only politically, but culturally in the neighborhood, someone who has dealt with so many people, in their hour of grievance. For those who don't know, former state representative Harry Reiss was also a funeral director. So not only has he done tons of constituency services, over the years, but is also obviously, serviced, families, in their, most, precious, hours and days after the loss of a loved one. So, to talk a little just about, that experience of taking on, someone, that is so not obviously you weren't running against him. He had endorsed someone, for that race. But, again, with everything that you talked about your background, I'm really interested just to get your perspective of what, that experience, was like, in an area that, definitely as someone who's been in politics, for the last 20 years, that area of town is considered a place where a candidate like yourself would never be able to win. And you proved all that wrong. And I would love just to hear about your perspective of proving the naysayers wrong.
I've been proving people wrong my whole life. I think back to my 2nd grade teacher who told my mom that I was a bad kid not going anywhere. And here I am. So yeah, I mean, when I first got into the race, Representative Reed Shaw was still potentially running for re-election. So folks told me, it can't be done. And it most certainly can't be done by somebody like you. And then he retired, which came as a surprise, certainly. But he endorsed Heather Cass, who, Carrick native, and as it turned out, a very vocal Trump supporter. And that tended, I think, to color the whole primary a little bit. And I did not talk about her a whole lot. I wanted to focus on talking with regular folks who are in the district and hearing what their thoughts and ideas are for the future of District 36. And I think the most important thing that I keep reminding people is that it's not that someone like me couldn't win in South Pittsburgh. It's that South Pittsburgh was under-organized. And so that's why I'm continuing to do the work that I'm doing now. In my primary election, between myself and volunteers, we made over 16,000 phone calls. Now, not all of those, a whole lot of those were voicemails, but still, I personally made over 3,000 phone calls, which is a lot. My voice was worn out for sure. And that's in addition to, lit dropping and then pre-pandemic, the doors that we knocked. And I'm still, there has not been a weekend where I have not called people. And the calls now are, how's it going? What issues are important to you? What would you like to see your state rep work on? Are you struggling in any kind of way? What resources can I connect you with? And sometimes people forget that organizing isn't about winning elections. It's about building strength and power and connection in community. And so to talk with folks, I mean, my focus right now is on people who don't typically vote. Maybe they voted in 2020 for the first time, or maybe they haven't voted in 5 or 6 years. And I call those people because those are people that nobody talks to. And their thoughts about the future of our community are important. And so I think that's the lesson there, is that if someone truly cares about their community and is willing to do the hard work of organizing, then anything is possible. But you can't let that work stop on election day. And I think that's what so many people do, is they get into office and they, it's a busy job, but they forget to make time for reaching out to people, because not everyone's going to call my office, but I can call them.
Absolutely. Miracle?
Yeah, I really like that. This idea that, you're proactively engaging communities that have been left behind. I think that's one of the important reasons why we need a bevy of folks with various backgrounds, like running for office. And so I know one of the other issues that you've been very vocal about is environmental justice. And you spoke a lot about that, like the intersections. But what are some of the things that you see as important to the people of your region? Because, the air quality in Pittsburgh continues to be a lot. We just celebrated, I think, this past week, technically having clean water, so meeting the standards that, the EPA has been setting. And we've just been doing that. A lot of it has been because of this COVID-19 crisis, where people have been able to push and organize and galvanize around these issues. So what are some of the things that you're hearing and some of the things that you're looking forward to doing to addressing some of the environmental concerns?
Yeah, so in my district, I do hear a lot about clean air and clean water, but I hear even more about landslides and flooding. My district, like quite a lot of Pittsburgh, is hills and valleys. And in one valley, it's Sawmill Run, they moved the stream to build the road. And as that turns out, it is a horrible idea. And so if we get a heavy rain, it floods. It's, a major way to get from here to there for folks. And so I hear a lot from folks who are concerned about flooding, about water management. And then, of course, with flooding comes weaker hillsides and landslides. We've had folks lose houses in landslides very recently. So it's definitely a concern. So to help people make the connection between the fact that they always have to take their Claritin, otherwise, they're miserable all day with these allergies, and they're worried about the flood because the streams in their backyard are falling off the hillside, to help them make that connection to the damage that we've done to our environment on kind of the climate level is really important. So I have a lot of those conversations, and I try to do a lot of work helping to educate my community about what policies and priorities there are out there. But I do think, one of the things that often happens in conversations about the environment is there's this idea that having a clean environment is somehow at odds with having family-sustaining jobs. And I don't think that's true. I think what happens is that environmental organizers are in their own silo, and labor leaders are in another silo, and they don't often talk to each other. And when they do, it doesn't always go well. And so I see myself as someone who can help bridge those divides. And I think it's really important that we do, because I don't think we get to environmental justice if we leave impacted communities behind, or if we leave workers behind. And I believe that there are enough jobs to go around in a clean energy economy. We have to work with organized labor to help make that transition possible. And when I campaigned on this, people were like, what's your environmental policy? And I was like, my environmental policy, look, here's some things I'm supportive of, but really at its core, my environmental policy is we all got to talk to each other. And people kind of laughed at me about that. They said, you're not going to get operating engineers at the same table as Penn Environment, or you're not going to get conservation voters at the same table as IBEW. But I have already. I've only been in office since January. And I brought together at a public event Katie Bloom from Conservation Voters and Chris Anderson from IBEW. And I heard the phrase, "I agree with," more often than I heard the phrase, "I don't like that, that's wrong," or "I disagree with." Because there is so much more that we hold in common when it comes to policy than we disagree on. And the event in particular was focused on RGGI. RGGI, for those who don't know, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is a policy that the governor is considering implementing that would basically put a tax on carbon emissions. And then you could use the carbon emissions for whatever. And the governor is able to allocate part of that, and the state legislature would be able to allocate another part of that. And my concern is about how those funds are allocated. Because we've seen studies from other places like California, for example, that show that if RGGI is implemented badly, all it does is further concentrate pollution in Black and brown and poor communities, which is not what we want to see. It may, decrease emissions overall, but then further concentrate it. That's exactly what we don't want to see. And so the governor has talked about using some of that money to invest in environmental justice communities, is what he calls them. I've yet to see a good definition of what that means, so I'll be looking for that. And I want to know what that investment looks like. We also need to see investment in jobs. People talk about job retraining, but I think what they don't realize is that there are jobs that use the same skill set in clean energy. Pipe fitters and steam fitters can work in clean energy storage. I mean, there's all kinds of tech that uses the existing skills that these workers already have. We just need to make sure that they have a smooth transition to that next job. And I'll often use fracking as an example, right? So fracking is been around for a very short time compared to other kinds of production. And so, folks transitioned into that. And, as it seems like the economy is hitting fracking way more than the state legislature ever could. And, that folks will transition to another job. But we want to make sure that that's smooth. And the only way we do that is by having conversations with everybody impacted at the table. And I have to imagine some of those conversations are not going to go well. Some yelling, some screaming, some hurt feelings. But they're important conversations for us to have, and I'm excited to keep providing a platform for those conversations to happen.
Ryan, you can take the next one.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Kahari. Yeah, so education is another area where you've shown a lot of interest in and a lot of focus on advocating in that field. So, with school board elections, the primary is coming up in May. If there's just any specific issues that people should be prioritizing, focusing on candidates that have certain stances on certain issues, if there's just any issues in this specific election cycle that are of any serious importance and deserve that special focus when people are electing people for school board and other education-related positions that you wanted to speak about.
Oh, there's a whole bunch. So please forgive me if I ramble on for a little while. Yeah, I think we really need to think about education systematically. We have in Pittsburgh, for example, an education system that has continually failed students with disabilities, Black and brown students, zip codes determining education, which is the exact opposite of what we want to see. And a lot of that's a state issue. We need more state funding for education to even out those disparities, because when we rely on property taxes, you end up with rich districts and you end up with poor districts. We need to also think about getting rid of police in schools. I'm excited. There are two candidates running for school board in my area, and both of them favor getting police out of schools. And I'm so excited about that. I think that's really important. And of course, both of them have made the distinction between the school security guards and police officers. And so there's a whole conversation to be had there. And I think that's something for candidates and for voters to really consider. I think we need to think about the role of charter schools as well. I'm never going to tell a parent to not make the choice that is best for their kid when it comes to that kid getting a high quality education. Those individual choices are never the problem. Right? Because so often a charter school is the better choice for an individual child. But when we look at things at a systems level, charter schools end up benefiting some kids, but not benefiting other kids. And then we end up overpaying per kid to the charter compared to what we're spending on kids who are in that traditional public school. And so when we're thinking about approving charter schools, when we're thinking about charter school funding, we really need to think, I personally think about equity. Charter schools tend to not serve kids with more significant needs related to their disabilities. They tend to, they're very selective in their admissions process. And so when we're thinking about funding, when we're thinking about the burden on PPS, let's say, of transporting kids to these charter schools, we really need to make sure that we're spending equitably. And honestly, I can never blame a parent for choosing a charter. Never will do it, because we know that so often these traditional public schools are absolutely failing children. And so, never going to blame the parent for making that choice, the caregiver for making that choice. But I do believe what we really need to do is heavily invest in those traditional public schools and to make sure that we're implementing policies that don't continue criminalizing children. Why are we arresting kids, sending them to the magistrate, and then, eventually they get to common pleas court and all of a sudden they've got a record? It makes no sense to me. Folks talk about the school to prison pipeline, but I think, sometimes when we've got schools that are literally criminalizing children, it's not a pipeline. It just is what it is, at that point. So those are some of my thoughts on education. A lot of that is related to state funding, but certainly, when it comes to school board and how you're allocating dollars and how you're changing policies around safety for kids in schools, I want to see unapologetically progressive candidates on those issues.
Right. And again, for those just joining us, this is the Sunday Night Sit-Down with the One Hood Power team. And we are here with State Representative Jessica Benham. And we've talked about education, disability rights, environmental justice. So now, as we go to the final part of the show, wanted to move to an issue that's near and dear to us. And that's election integrity and voting rights. I know you recently said that you were, on a call, about this. As you can talk a little bit about, what you're working on, around this issue, and if you have any particular concerns, about, the efforts to protect voting rights in the state of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, so I have lots of thoughts, and I think the biggest thought that I have is that voters are so often unaware of the ways in which their voting rights are being threatened. There are so many bills in our state house right now that would make it more difficult for people to vote, place more restrictions on people using mail-in ballots, voter ID laws, all kinds of things that, are supposedly meant to address fraud. But when we actually see no evidence of fraud in the system, all we're doing is disenfranchising people. And then we can look at which groups we're more often disenfranchising. I think that is a massive problem. So for me, I support legislation that is going to make it easier for people to vote. Things like automatic voter registration, same day registration. I think that, we should continue to have no excuse mail-in ballots. Those things are really important to me, because when we make it easier for people to engage in democracy, I think that makes our democracy as a whole stronger. But certainly our voting rights are under threat, and they're often under threat because of misplaced concerns about security and about fairness. Now, certainly valid concerns in those areas exist. I think, for example, about the polling place consolidation that happened during the primary. In South Pittsburgh, we saw a massive problem where voters in the primarily Black parts of the Hilltop had to go all the way to Carrick to vote because their polling place was closed. And, and I brought up that issue and, was told, oh, well, every polling place will be open in the general, don't worry about it. And, to me, I think that's not okay. It is an example of folks either not thinking things through, which frankly I think is the case. People just didn't think about that, and people were not at the table who should have been at the table when those decisions about consolidation were being made. I don't think that it was intentionally malicious, but it's an example of what happens when we do not have representative groups of people making choices. It's systemic in that way. And then when it comes to security, I think about, for example, the counting of mail-in ballots, where observers were not really able to get close enough to see the process. And that again is another problem. And so there are definitely valid concerns when it comes to security and trust in our elections. But I think we have to be careful how we talk about those. And certainly we have to be incredibly careful about how we legislate around those issues.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer, because I know that we in Pennsylvania, there's like over 14 bills popping up to talk about the various issues of election integrity. And I was wondering, because you're fielding phone calls, you're reaching out to folks, are there things that people are specifically asking that legislators look at in addition to what you're talking about, whether it's automatic voter registration, whether it's same-day voter registration? Are there some ideas that you're hearing and think that will be entertained at the Capitol in the coming months?
Oh, that is a really good question. And I do hear from folks who are really interested in making sure that we expand access to the ballot box as much as possible. But I think the biggest thing that I hear about when I'm talking to folks about elections is gerrymandering. Now, people are really frustrated with the thought that politicians can basically draw their own boundaries and choose their voters rather than voters choosing their elected officials. And, there was some movement from Fair Districts PA to have a nonpartisan citizens redistricting commission, which of course would have required action from the legislature to make that happen. And I support that idea. I think that it is a problem when we have leadership from both parties as the ones trying to draw these boundaries. It politicizes the process, and you end up with, I often joke that my district looks like some kind of dragon that you would see on heraldry. You end up with these odd-looking districts that don't necessarily have those kind of shared interests that it makes it difficult to represent. Or I think about, for example, Baldwin Borough. I have the northern half of Baldwin Borough, and Nick Pisatano has the southern half of Baldwin Borough, and so we've split this borough in half. And of course, Nick and I communicate as best as possible about what's happening in the borough, but it would be, I think, much better for the borough if they had one person to go to and instead. Or I think about Brookline. The neighborhood of Brookline is split between my district, Dan Miller's district, and Dan Deasy's district. So like chopped into 3 parts. And so you have, these really cohesive neighborhoods with shared interests, and then they get chopped up in ways that make no sense simply because of politicizing the process. And it's interesting to me because I think about gerrymandering as this sort of nerdy political topic, but it is, when I talk to folks, it is an issue that they bring up, that folks are thinking about. I would say the top thing that people are thinking about right now is vaccines. So I definitely hear that on the phone all the time. But otherwise, when we're talking about elections, it's gerrymandering.
Absolutely. Ron, did you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Kahar. Just as like a final question for me, just continuing on the topic of gerrymandering, since you brought that up, another issue and type of gerrymandering that we've been really concerned about and have been following a lot is judicial gerrymandering, which has been floated around in the legislature for a while. And we know it didn't make it on the ballot for these May primaries. But do you see that as something that the legislature is gonna keep making an effort to push through, maybe in the fall this year or further down the line? Do you see that as something that'll probably resurface? Or
I think it probably will resurface, and the question is whether or not the Republicans have the votes within their caucus to pass it. And I find it very concerning. When it looked like it was going to be on the May ballot, I actually was organizing voter outreach specifically about that issue, phone banks around that issue, because when it comes to every single right that we hold dear, it comes down to the courts. I mean, it does. And so to elect people from gerrymandered districts is not going to be reflective of the Commonwealth as a whole. And I think the reason why it's so important for the state as a whole to elect these judges is that the decisions that these judges make impact the whole state. And so the last thing, I think, it wouldn't be fair for someone to go before a judge who knew nothing about their community, their area, who they did not vote for, to have a decision made about their lives. And I think the way that the system is right now, it encourages the judges to travel around the Commonwealth to get to know people from other areas and to not just represent the area that they're from. And one of the reasons that the Republicans are pushing this, according to them, is that they think we need geographic diversity in our courts. They say, too many judges come from Pittsburgh and come from Philly. And that's kind of true. But the reality is that future judges come from all over the Commonwealth to go to law school in Pittsburgh and Philly, graduate and stick around to practice. So we do have geographic diversity on our courts in terms of where people are from. And I think that those perspectives are incredibly, incredibly important. But at the end of the day, it's political. The Republicans want to control the courts, and the only way that they can do that is through gerrymandering, just like they've done that to our state house and our state senate.
Right, and then in our last few moments, I was going to ask a question and give Miracle the opportunity to close this out. So, as someone who is obviously very concerned, about urban issues, what are some of the things, just from a policy standpoint, that you think that in your role in Harrisburg and the state legislature in general can be of benefit to the city of Pittsburgh, from a policy perspective? There's certain initiatives or certain things that you would, like to see the state and the city work together on?
Oh, yeah, I think there are, and I think there's a couple things that the city and the county have done, or the county has tried to do, that we should implement on the state level. For example, like paid sick leave, I think is a good example of that. I think that the state should allow cities to set their own minimum wages. I think that that's something that the state and the city should cooperate on. I think when it comes to addressing all of these problems that we're seeing with policing, that requires cooperation at every single level of government. There are changes that we need to make on the state level when it comes to the power of police unions, for example, when it comes to the ways in which police are under the law permitted to act. But so much of it comes down to what happens in municipalities and counties. So that requires action at every single level of government. So I would love to see that kind of cooperation happen. But I also look to some of the policies that the city has passed as examples, again, for what the state should do. Non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people, for example. But I would say, one of the biggest crises facing Pittsburgh, and this is an area where the state needs to take action too, is looking at the ways in which this city and this region is such a horrible place for Black people and Black women in particular to live. And, the city needs to take more steps to address that. The county needs to take more steps to address that. But frankly, a lot of it comes down to funding, and that's the role of the state. And so there are some exciting bills around addressing Black maternal mortality that I'm really enthusiastic about. There's some bills around making sure that there are job opportunities for Black and brown people, especially post-pandemic here as we're trying to rebuild our economy. There is so much that the city needs to do, the county needs to do, and the state needs to do to address that. Because if we're going to talk about most livable cities, I always ask for who, because it's certainly not most livable for disabled people or for queer people. And I don't know from personal experience, but I know from talking to people and from reading that it's not the most livable for Black and brown folks too. So I think I would end there and say that my vision is to truly realize that idea of a city where people can live and people can thrive. And that requires cooperation at every level of government.
Absolutely. Thank you. And to close us out, Miracle.
Yes, this is the answer we ask everyone. Um, and to go on a high note, what is something that is bringing you joy, that is giving you joy? You're traveling back and forth to Harrisburg, you're driving, dealing with, a variety of issues and even threats. So what is something that like gives you joy?
Oh, I think there are two things. The first thing is the interactions that I have with constituents. I love talking with people. I'm very much a talker. I also love hearing people's stories. And so one of my favorite things about the drive to and from Harrisburg is that it's a great opportunity for me to return constituent calls. And so I get to have these long conversations that I otherwise wouldn't have the time for. And I learn, so much about what people care about. So, today I got a call from someone who's really concerned about gun regulations and wanted to make sure that we made those stronger. And so to hear those personal experiences, even if they're really crappy experiences, and to relate with people on that human level, I think gives me a lot of joy. The second thing is my cat. I adore my cat, Ravi. He travels with me. He loves adventure. He's not I left him in the hotel, but he is just, when you're having a really long day, it's so much better when you have a little cat curled up asleep on your lap. And he brings joy to other people too. There are so many folks who stop by my office in Harrisburg to say hi to the cat. I'm like, nobody comes to see me. They all come to see the cat. But I think, right now when Harrisburg is empty, there are no lobbyists here, there are no visitors here. To have that little bit of company, it cheers me up.
Thank you so much. And again, for those who are just joining us, we just had a wide-ranging and incredible conversation with Jessica Benham, state representative. Thank you so much, for joining us. And again, sorry for the miscue in the middle. It's like I knew that, but it's so funny sometimes how your brain, particularly the live Sunday night sit down, broadcast is a lot different from how we usually do it when we tape on Fridays. We have an opportunity for do-overs, but the magic of live streaming, you know what I mean? You get a little bit of everything. You got to roll with
It's
the
all
punches.
good.
But thank you so much for that, and and thank you for all the work that you're doing and your continued journey, proving the naysayers wrong, and all the work that you're doing in service of the folks of South Pittsburgh and the Southern Hill communities of Allegheny County. So thank you so much for joining us again, State Representative Jessica Benham.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And again, that was State Representative Jessica Benham joining us, talking again about a wide range of issues from education to environmental justice, to inclusivity, to disability rights. Wow, and I think that's just a great example, why, we wanted to bring her on the show, and why, across political circles in Western Pennsylvania, she's considered, a rising star, for what she brings to the table, but also, just how, interesting, the backstory is, just, everything that she brings to the table, as well as running in a part of Pittsburgh and Allegheny County that is not considered the most progressive part. And that's not, no disrespect. There's tons of progressives in the Southern Hilltops and South Pittsburgh and the South Hills, but if we're all just being honest, there is a certain perception, someone of her profile, may look to the East End or some other area of town that's considered, oh, this might be, this constituency might be quote unquote, more accepting, but what she proved, so much is that, if you reach out and connect with people, regardless of what the perception of the constituency is, you never know what that constituency is until you actually sit down and talk to people.
Yeah, and I think it was really interesting how she was saying she makes it a priority to contact people who aren't active voters. I think that's so important when we talk about, organizers getting in these elected positions. You know, your work is never done. Like communication never fails. So I think that was a good takeaway, and I hope that's something that more people do is to have people feel included in these electoral processes. So maybe that we can actually start to get movement on a lot of legislation that makes people's lives better.
Yeah, and along those same lines, I also appreciated her, essentially speaking to our mission statement briefly when she was talking about how, so often we look at the end game as just the election and getting people elected, but really that's more a means to serve the actual ultimate end game of building community power. That's more a means to an end than an end itself. So I also appreciated her emphasizing that point.
Yeah, and absolutely. And as you know, tonight is Sunday night, which means one thing. Tomorrow is Monday, which means at 7 p.m. We will be back live streaming for the Power Hour, and we're very excited about tomorrow night's edition. We're going to be talking to women in leadership, making a difference in the face of adversity. And Miracle, you want to talk a little bit about what to expect tomorrow night?
Yes, we have a whole lineup of amazing, phenomenal women. And it just so happened that this show was booked at the very beginning of the week. People who are looking at environmental justice, people who are looking at ways to help make sure that children are included in everything that's going on with the city. We have Alyssa from Be Urban Kind, who's now cutting up the environmental justice sector. We have Dr. Crystal from Partner for Works, and we're talking about what's going on with the program. Crystalline for the Partner to Work program for youth in the city. We have Judy, who's from the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, who is here to talk about ways that we can actually support the local AAPI community. And again, this was a book before the event happened on Tuesday. And we have the new mayor of Rankin, the first ever African American mayor, joining us to talk about what her issues, her vision for the Bureau is going into, this new appointment. And so we hope that you will tune in on our Facebook and YouTube pages tomorrow at 7 p.m. as we, kick off this Women's History month with just great women leaders from all across this county who are doing phenomenal things, putting policy into action, and bringing more people to the table with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the spirit of full disclosure, tomorrow is my birthday as well. For those who keep up with those kinds of things, and you'll probably see it all on my Facebook page tomorrow. But yeah, so that's another cool aspect about tomorrow, the big 45. So I will be officially middle age. They say middle age is 60. 45 to 64. So I got a few more hours of youth left in the middle of a pandemic and nothing to do about it. Oh well.
You were forever young, Kari. I feel like we got it. We can't leave without showing the people the shirt. I see rocking for the verses.
Yeah. Ghostface Killer. For all the Wu-Tang fans out there, like myself, who are about 45 years old or a little bit older than that, that would be about the age of typical hardcore Wu-Tang fans. So, we're going to ride it out, like the Deadheads did with the Grateful Dead. You know what I mean? We're going to be 25 years from now, we're going to be, in our 70s, throwing up our W's.
Listen, I support it all. Like, happy birthday! I do hope you turn up, have fun. There's a lot of stuff you can do in the pandemic. You got the fire pit in the back.
That's true. Absolutely. I did have a few friends over for social distancing Raekwon Ghostface watch party, so that was cool.
All right. Well, I do think that's it. Thank you all so much for joining the Sunday Night Sit Down. We have invitations out to a lot of folks. If there's, again, as always, if there's somebody you would like us to interview, tag us in their comments or reach out to them and bring them on.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us. Stay engaged, stay involved, and most importantly, stay safe. And we'll see you tomorrow night for the One Heard Power Hour.